I want to start off from this slide, which is one of the early ones that Kate showed. It's the combined index of health and social problems, in which all these health and social problems are weighted equally. I want to come back to it really for two reasons. One is really to ask, are there other ways of explaining this lineup, that these countries have more social problems and these say less? Is there any explanation apart from saying that the ones that do worse are more unequal? People used sometimes to say it's the English-speaking countries that do worse, and you know, you've got New Zealand, UK, USA, but actually on some of the variables that we've looked at, some of the social problems, you can actually explain why one of the English-speaking countries does worse than another in terms of the amount of inequality. I think that's true on, for instance, mental illness. But the other thing is it's not always English-speaking countries doing badly. There's Portugal, very different kind of society from the USA. And when we have data for Singapore, it's usually up here too. And actually, it's hard to think of societies more different from each other than USA, UK, Portugal, Singapore. It's not just a cultural similarity up there, explaining why those do badly. If you look at the countries that do well, again, you might say that there's an obvious cultural similarity between the Nordic countries, Norway, Sweden, Finland, the Netherlands. They all do pretty well. But Japan is down there too. And actually, it's hard to think of societies more different from each other in the developed world than Sweden and Japan. And think of the position of women, or how closely they keep to the traditional nuclear family structure. Think even of the way they get their greater equality. The Japanese, well, the Swedes do it largely through taxes and benefits redistribution, a large welfare state. The Japanese, on the other hand, spend less, the public social expenditure is a smaller part of their GNP per capita than in any of the other, I think almost any of the other OECD countries. So Japan and Sweden are at opposite ends of the pole from that point of view. But Japan manages to be equal because its incomes before taxation, differences in earnings are smaller. So, you know, Sweden is the big state model and Japan has a small state. So not only differences in position of women, in family structure, but also in the role of the state. And yet they're both fairly equal, and so they both do well. So I don't think one can say that these countries are down here simply because of something about the Nordic countries. But also, even if you chopped off Finland, Norway, Sweden, Japan, that end, and you chopped off the USA and Portugal, that end, or the UK as well, you'd still have a significant relationship in between. And I think actually it's very hard to think of any other explanation for that sort of lineup. The second reason I wanted to come back to this graph is just to point out what you, I'm sure, realized as we went through them, that it's usually the same countries that do badly each time and the same countries that do well. I mean, I imagine you noticed that UK, USA, Portugal have high prison populations, high obesity, our health isn't very good. In fact, the USA, I think, comes about number 28 or 30 in the International League table of life expectancy. And so, on almost all those variables, they polarize in a fairly similar way. And again, at the good end, it's always the same countries that do well. So what we're talking about is a sort of general social dysfunction that's related to inequality. It's not just one or two things. If you know about a country's health, you can make a good guess at its imprisonment rates and how well its children do in the international maths and literacy scores and how much violence it has. how many people use different drugs. So we have to stop thinking about individual social problems and thinking just about the causes of teenage births or the causes of violence. What we're talking about is a much more fundamental social process related to inequality. I want now to move on to first just to point out that this is not something that just affects the poor in each society, it affects all of us. But then to move on to try and explain why we are apparently so sensitive to inequality. From the scale of the differences that Kate was showing you, for instance in mental health or in the rates of violence or any of these other problems, they were nearly all huge differences. And you can't explain such large differences just in terms of what's happening to the bottom 10 or 20%, the poorest bit of the population. And take, for instance, the 4.5 or 5 year differences in life expectancy between the USA and Japan. If that was all due to what was happening to the bottom 10%, the bottom 10% in Japan would have to live 45 or 50 years longer than the bottom 10% in the USA. And of course that isn't what's happening. And you get these very large differences in all the outcomes we've shown you because they're affecting most of the population. And in a way you can deduce that just from the size of the differences. But there is also other very strong evidence of what's going on. This graph shows infant mortality rates, and it compares infant mortality in England and Wales with Sweden. Some Swedish researchers, this is quite a long time ago, classified a number of their deaths, a large number of deaths, according to the British Registrar General's occupational class classification. Here's class 1, the people at the top, going down through the non-manual occupations, down to the skilled manual, semi-skilled and unskilled manual. And you can see that infant mortality rates in England and Wales have quite a steep social gradient, and these red bars are Sweden, with a pretty erratic social gradient. I mean, they have differences, but you can see it's nothing like our gradient. I might point out that you might, if you were to try and draw a line through the tops of these blue columns, you'd get a line that sort of angle, and with the red ones, something much flatter. But you'd get, what you see is that the differences in infant mortality are much bigger at the bottom between the two countries than at the top. But even at the top, Sweden seems to do better. So Sweden is healthier than England and Wales, partly because they're a more equal society. Although it makes the biggest difference at the bottom, it still seems to make some difference to the top. The top social class seems to benefit as well. You can look at adult mortality. There was another paper going through the same sort of comparison with the same findings.